Hello. Hello. My name is Colin Maclay. I'm from the University of Southern California, where I run a thing called the Annenberg Innovation Lab. I'm thrilled to be here with you today. If you're anything like me, you're kind of torn between all of the different great conversations that were just happening, and we're only able to go to one, which was great, but it was also sad because you missed 4 other ones. So the bad news is we can't fix that. The good news is there are great notes from the groups, so you'll be able to kind of access those later. In the context of this conversation, however, we want to have a conversation and not try to recount each of those 5 great conversations. Because as great as they were, we only have about half an hour, 40 minutes. What we want to do is really force ourselves, each of these groups, to kind of highlight just a couple, like 1, 2, or perhaps 3 key insights and or questions. So to not recount the entire dialogue and not even recount the most perfect questions or the most perfect insights, but to just give us a flavor of the connectors, of the drivers and forces at play between in this kind of AI and inclusion discussion from each of these categories. So the idea being that if we can get each of those on the table from each group, then we can identify some interconnections and some kind of common questions, some shared issues across these, and to start a conversation from there. So that's what I want to do. Does that make any sense at all? So this is really distilling into a few nuggets, part of that conversation, not the whole conversation, very tweetish, to be able to launch a conversation. So we'll do that. We'll do a quick roundup of the 5 groups, and then really just open it up for observations on those interconnections, on other points that weren't raised in that first round, to give us each of a flavor, and then carry us through lunch into the conversation about where these points of interconnections are. Okay. Do people feel like that's a yes? Yes! Come on. We have to make it through lunch. Come on. All right. So what I want to do is just go to the, I see we already have this great picture. This is all visualized there. We even have the key findings. Which group is this from right here that's up? Michaela?
You want to start, Leila? All right, Leila is going to start. I think we need a mic so that everyone can hear you.
Yeah, there she is.
Thank you. I'm Leila Keser, Istanbul Bilgi University. I'm director of the IT Law Institute there. And as Law and Governance breakout group, we determined 3 important key findings. One of them is the lack of legal definition of AI, and there are lots of AI definition since we heard yesterday. Really many definition, but when it comes to legal one, there is no. Maybe it will be important to the legal person to create a common one, the legal definition of AI. And there is also open questions in terms of law discipline. For example, the liability is one of the important question of lawyer regarding the algorithms and AI also. And there is also no common methodology or alternative methodology. That is the second key findings of us. It's also important to know for multi-stakeholder model, local or international multi-stakeholder model would help to solve kind of problems or create more definite roadmap for the people. And the third one is there is also no clear understanding as to technology itself. We need to understand how algorithms work in order to eliminate bias or in order to make it more understandable, interpretable. We need to understand the details, the technical works of the technology itself. That's the third one.
Great. Thank you for modeling that so wonderfully. Just while we're here, any quick questions on that? Needed for clarification? That's that feels clear to folks? Okay, great. Now on to group number next. Is there an image up there? That's the second page, so maybe go back one.
Comment? You? All right.
Thank you. Great. So our session was, my name, again, is Ursula Weinhoven. I'm from the ITU. Our session was on business models. We had a really lively discussion. It probably could have gone on another hour. So it's a little hard to choose just a few things, but I'll do my utmost best. As you can see, we started with talking about what do we actually mean by a business model.
You can't recount the whole trajectory, okay?
I promise I won't. We started by looking at what we meant by business models. We had some discussion around that, and you can see some of the key points up there. There was a lot of interest in how can we work inclusion into the business model in the first place, so it's baked right in. And we looked at different dimensions of what we mean by inclusion, which we felt was relevant for the business case. We also talked about, another theme was, how do we move from corporate social responsibility and philanthropy to thinking about creating shared value, and what can we learn from other areas like corporate sustainability, where a lot of these kind of challenges have been around for a while. So how can we learn from that to have new business models? Maybe we can have page 2. A couple of interesting points that came up was around this whole question of prices and profiling, and some interesting examples that were shared were around how if you're looking on Google for a particular flight, you might be charged a lot more than if you're just looking for a flight generally to that country, and they're raising ethical questions. And on the other hand, would that just be a Robin Hood approach, which is not really appropriate necessarily, some people thought, for a company? Or is it just like bargaining in the marketplace? So you can see we had some really interesting discussions around these themes. And then maybe just one other point around the ideas around social entrepreneurship, where business models, it's not just about profit. There's other types of value which is factored in as well. So there was interest in that, and to see how, for this area, we could really build on those. So, that sound okay? Please do. It wasn't very inclusive.
Where is it?
So, just very briefly, in the end, we were essentially dancing around what is the role of government in terms of regulating data about human beings when they are the product and when they have no means of control over it. And we built on an analogy that Ursula actually came up with, which was the analogy of the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, and the idea that, she couldn't predict that her cells would be used to help others, but she did not benefit from it either financially or emotionally in any way. No one can predict that. What does that mean for data?
Great. All right, next group. And then, so I hope as you're hearing these, kind of pulling out the themes that feel resonant from other groups to your group and to the conversations that you had, right? So this is the idea here. We're identifying kind of common themes across all these different conversations. So
maybe we don't have a screenshot of
okay.
all yet, so it's not spoken yet. We will find you.
So there's the algorithm and design group. Great. One new result. Boom. That was magic.
So I think that's one of about 17 pages that we wrote. But not to sort of summarize, just very quickly to give a few takeaways. We talked about algorithm and design at various levels, at input and output data, at black boxes, at algorithms, at the infrastructure, at the platform level, how you bake it into the education space and into curricula. So we looked at various strategies and approaches to actually help design of systems be more fair and equitable. And I think one of the really interesting takeaways that we had was this is an issue that the public actually really cares about. Like, it's really hard to argue against fairness, so we should really be using that to, help inform and engage with advocacy efforts. And I think we also looked at how, if there are 21 definitions of fairness, is it okay to have 21 kinds of algorithms? And we also talked about the need for more data not just in terms of to look at whether it's biased, unbiased, clean, dirty, etc., but also in terms of how when you actually affect fairness, whether it's actually working. So we wanted to look at how, are there good proxies to look at fairness, even if you can't make systems more explainable as algorithms create more algorithms which then generate new features. Is explainability or transparency even the end result of what our efforts are? Or should we be actually aspiring to more things? And I think finally one thing was how if all of these are socially and politically constructed and technology has agency, do we just look for something neutral, or do we actually aspire for something that's much higher than neutrality? So I think I'll just leave it there.
Great, thank you. There's the infrastructure group that's remaining.
So are you? Great.
Okay, that's cool blue neon stuff. So I'm gonna try to make a very short summary, but this process. That's another group.
Sorry. The paper there, it's not from your group, just the comment.
So would they like to go first, and I can go?
It's just probably just to change the
Okay.
photo.
Cool. I don't know which mine is. I'm sorry. Okay. We'll get that up, I guess. Okay, but so I just want to continue. Should we wait until we get the text up? Because what I'm saying is not on the text. The text is just additional material that you can look up on Twitter. Okay. So there is no reasoned way, no transparent way in which I came upon this summary, which leads me really to the first part, that there is nothing new under the sun, that a lot of the problems that we are having with, or issues that we are discussing with data and infrastructure really are issues we've been discussing across the board on everything. There were like references made all the way back to media studies and 1920s debates in media studies and democracy theory, to the kinds of problems we've been having with regard to open data and IoT collected data and data quality, etc. So there isn't really anything new. Infrastructure level problems like accessibility, and procedural inclusion and fairness are still central, and we can't address many of the other issues fairly until and unless we address these. But there is a caveat. There are some things, some kinds of problems which are exacerbated because of AI, things which might have existed earlier. For example, groupings by identities, which we don't present consciously, but by statistics which we represent. Now, and we may not realize. Now, these kinds of groupings have been happening in areas maybe like insurance, but now it's all pervasive, and we aren't necessarily defining ourselves. Other people are defining us by various identities. These kinds of problems may be new, and we may face new problems also when we have sovereign machines which are emotively and rationally sovereign. But until then, it's a bunch of same problems. Data-based exclusion, data exploitation, and data colonialism. There's a large discussion to be had here on things such as surveillance capitalism versus excluding the poor, which is preferable. And about there was a point made that privileged might determine the narrative, whether it is about surveillance capitalism or whether it is about things like net neutrality. And some people, as forms of inclusion, might actually want the free choice to be a data subject itself. While talking about data colonialism, how free trade, fair trade, and all these things are so complicated and when it comes to even coming up with conceptual solutions, leave alone practical ones, pragmatic ones in a geopolitical system, to questions of data flow and data trade and data colonialism. So there's a problem. could I end with one last line, which is that there is no such thing as neutrality, and we have to move beyond neutrality to other questions of how we evaluate biases and counter biases, etc.
Thank you. Great. Last group. Fabulous.
Thank you. I'm Arisa, and I would like to kind of share the topics what we discussed in the user behavior expectations. And what I thought is, so we discussed within like less than 20 people, and we had the person from Kenya and from the university, and also the person from the Microsoft. So it would be nice to share the information from both point of view. So what we have discussed is that from Sarah's perspective, that the AI in Kenya is not so pervasive yet. So he discussed about the importance of education, and could you give us some?
Okay, just briefly, I think there was a consensus that there is a huge need for education so that people actually develop an awareness of what expectations they need to have. And with that education also comes maybe a need for a new type of software engineering where people actually take into consideration their users and that sort of thing. And this would lead to, when you have a lot of people with the skills in AI, you'd have a diversity of people solving the problems and therefore a diversity of solutions. And you know, if there are many people tackling problems, then you end up, I think the user ends up coming into the center. I think that was in the realm of education.
Thanks a lot. And also from Alessandro from Microsoft gives us a very wonderful view from like how engineers discuss this kind of AI topics, and also the emotional intelligence. What do you think about that? So the topic.
Yeah, that was basically some of the principles that the group as a whole debated, and we tried to link those principles to the user's expectations, which is AI must be transparent. AI should maximize efficiency without affecting the dignity of people. AI should be designed for intelligent privacy. Of course, algorithm accountability and emotional intelligence embedded in AI solutions to calibrate Spock answers, right? Basically saying that. So that was the themes that the group debated. It is a live and healthy debate, and thanks a lot for the group.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so as you were trying to make sense of that, I'm curious to hear what people either heard or didn't hear as the intersections among those different observations from those conversations. For me, I heard a lot of stuff about definitions and the needing to kind of form clear definitions about what we're talking about, the need for understanding, and not just kind of initial understanding and learning, but ongoing strategies to continue to do that as we think about the implications for each of our different fields, which seems to be a common theme, also kind of adapting to saying in a legal environment or in computer science teaching, how do we think about the implications for our fields? Issues of incentives, why people, orgs, companies do the things they do. I heard about sectoral roles, strategies for learning, which I mentioned, the thinking about how to leverage the public interest, the caring on these things. What were the things that jumped out at any of you or that felt like they went unstated? Please, in the back.
Thanks. I'm Shaz Jameson from Tilt. As was commented by Rafael in our group, we've spoken a lot about moral compasses, about ethics, about norms, about fairness and inclusion, social good. But what's missing is we're trying to find a way, and we haven't heard social justice so much. We're kind of talking around it, but we're all kind of trying to find what we want to be doing without pointing to it directly. So that's what's missing from the conversation for me.
And one of the places that I heard that was sort of whether we had affirmative expectations around what these technologies could do, right? So that's sort of that connection of not just guiding it and trying to slow a train, but really to think about where we're steering it. Other observations? I'm attentive to the sides. I realize people feel like they've been left out. Come on.
Hi. Seeing these debates, I wonder if when we discuss values and human goals that we want to address in AI, considering risks and opportunities. We have a framework, international framework, which are the Sustainable Development Goals. All governments of the world agreed with this framework. So I wonder if besides checking AI against human rights instruments and humanitarian instruments, we could also check them against the SDGs. So then we lose less time discussing what we want to achieve and have a framework to discuss how to achieve it directly. SDGs speaks about everything we're discussing here. Thank you.
Very helpful, thank you. So that's the sort of connection to, there's a couple in the back there. How about these? We're going to take these two over here, and then we'll go to Nagla.
I think some of the intersections that we picked up from the groups were related to the ongoing problems of structural inequality and related to the social justice issues, the structural inequality around human rights framework as well, so the intersection of those. And I think, until we sort of try to look in terms of strategies and solutions to these, we keep coming back to the problems of lack of access, lack of intensity of use, lack of participation and representation in algorithmic data or big data, and therefore lack of representation from global south and underdeveloped countries. But as long as we keep speaking in paradigms that are quite individualistic, that are quite market-focused, not to say that these haven't driven take-up and made enormous advances, but in terms of addressing the structural inequalities, they're simply not going to address them. We've got to find new strategies of doing things. So I think alongside, in a hybrid way, looking at these inequalities and these lack of access from a more kind of communal point of view, communal access, looking at infrastructure in particular, but I think it applies to various other things, data as well, from the demand side value, not just the supply side value where you have, rentable extraction from commercial practices, looking at some of these demand side values that offer public and social goods, in terms of opening up spectrum to allow people to participate, to experiment with AI, etc., to provide public access so that people can supplement the inaffordable services that they've got, etc., have to be looked at to address these structural inequalities.
To follow some on these lines, I think what I keep asking myself in relationship to artificial intelligence, but more in relationship to inclusion, is as we are this diverse group of people sitting here talking about what are the possible solutions, problems, etc., what are the top 3, top 5 things that we more or less agree on, and how can we harness our power to focus on that? So for example, someone mentioned this morning, Felipe, algorithm accountability. Okay, there's lots of things that we can take on, but if we think about social justice and we think about inclusion, we think about a strategy and using the power that we have in this room, what are the top 3 issues that we're going to take on this year?
Thank you. I mean, that to some extent is this conversation, right, is trying to build on those.
Yes, I want to add something that keeps coming to my mind as I listen to the other breakouts. We talk about AI as one thing. So in our discussions, for example, when we talk about business models, a comment that was made by Philippe was that maybe we should think of business models in the tech industry, AI for governments, etc. This also comes from my conviction that we think of AI users as one group, perhaps, and AI production as another activity. The reason I say this is, again, thinking of inclusion and framing all of this under an inclusion framework. It is about participating in the production of the technologies. So when we say AI business models, is it one and the same? It's not one and the same. So how can we think of perhaps sort of distinguishing between the different types of AIs and the different uses in a way that can include not just the users, but also the production eventually in an equalizing manner. So to sort of against the asymmetry of power and data, technologies, etc.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like that connects to sort of some of the comments about the importance of context, about being user-centric, and this is sort of the cycle of production and consumption, and really changing. Yeah, thank you. Wolfgang.
Thank you. Maybe 3 things which I at least saw in many of the presentations or remarks. One is the struggle to find out what is actually new when we talk about AI. There are obviously some things, maybe this probabilistic turn, maybe the categorization, and that has, of course, a lot of potential impact on inclusion issues. But other things are simply talking about growing autonomy of technology, it's about algorithms as such, and so on. So what I find really interesting, and I see us all struggle to find that out together, is what are really the points where AI makes a difference that is important for our societal discussion. The second one is, and I think that's actually a really good thing in this context, is that the importance of technology really forces us to operationalize and think about specific things like inclusion, like fairness, and the procedures behind that. What is the role of politics and law there? The normal procedure was that we agree on a political process on things we have as common values, and then translate it into laws, and then it's a compliance issue. But of course it's much more complex. There are moral debates and different communities, and I think that we have the chance now to make clearer what our values actually are, how we frame fairness, how we frame inclusion is really something we should be thankful for the development that we have the chance to do that, and then see how that translates into our discussions about technology and governance. And maybe the third thing that came up in many discussions was that there is the need to bridge in a specific way different communities, software engineering, governance, and so on. And maybe one role of the network also already touched that issue. In the morning, one of the thing we could do as a network is to think about specific educational tools that we develop for one community for the other. The governance people for software engineers and the other way around. I think there are some attempts already, but there's still something to be done, and I think we can make a difference there.
Thank you, very helpful. Other thoughts? Oh, Malavika.
Thank you. A lot of the conversations here actually remind me of the old days of code is law. And I think when we actually think of AI as an object of governance, we're missing the fact that it's also producing governance and it's actually enacting it in many ways. So I think in the same way that we started to think of code as something that was a lawmaking artifact, I think if I'm hearing from a lot of the conversations that we're beginning to see AI in the same way, as something that implements values, that embeds normative practices and aspirations, and therefore seeing it as only something that we're going to regulate or not or leave alone, I think it misses that element of AI actually enforcing and enacting certain values and norms and actually being a media of governance.
So that, for me, is really helpful. I think that brings me back to the definitional piece of what are we really talking about. And there are moments where, as a technical matter, it's important to know what we're talking about, but also the way that we're talking about this suite of issues, right? As an object of governance, as a process, or otherwise. So I feel like that's another place where the way that you've just framed it, Malavika and Wolfgang, sort of helps orient how we might engage, or what we need to be able to engage productively with it. Nishan.
Hi, thank you. So I thought what's really striking in all these conversations is that there is a sense of temporality and a crisis of time that seems to kind of divide groups in different ways, because there are groups which are thinking of AI as disruption, and they are happier to be slow in kind of communicating with AI. We are waiting for it to kind of unfold, to figure out what really is going to happen, go more into speculation. And then there is a different organization of time which is looking at AI as crisis. Like there is no time left, like you have to act now and do something about it. And I think that reorganization of time that computing has always done might be good to bring back into conversation, because we don't want to fall back into an either-or debate about do we have enough time for research or do we need to act now. They both need to happen simultaneously, but they need their own temporality for the crossovers to happen. So that's, in terms of developing tactics, how this group can go further. Bringing in the time scale at what we are looking at, because for activists who are working on, let's say, Human Rights Watch, 3 months is too much. And for people who want to do deep dive research, which includes, for example, historical and definitional work, we'll need at least 5 years to get there. And how you're going to kind of bridge the divide between the two might be interesting to follow through.
So I think that's wonderful. To me, it's an urgent, important, another way to describe it. But I also feel like in the conversation we've had, so much of this is about process, right? It's not going to happen and be done, but it's an ongoing set of issues. And so I think that's very helpful to say we need to both act now and engage with this, but we're going to need to keep engaging over time and recognize that in the 3-month time frame, nothing's going to happen, but something's going to happen in the 5 years. So that's wonderfully helpful. Others who...
Hi, I'm Vidushi from Article 19. I just wanted to respond to a suggestion that was made earlier that we should look at sustainable development goals as opposed to human rights standards. I think there's a case to be made to keep human rights standards as the minimum requirement against which we then build legal and ethical frameworks, because I think what Malvika pointed out to in the morning about how companies often use terms like privacy very conveniently, that kind of happens when we focus on just ethical frameworks without an actual legally binding grounding. And I think that there is a conversation to be had about how different frameworks and competing values can be better established in the AI context.
And so there's a bunch of these comments which have been kind of about how AI, these issues change existing institutions and how they interact with those institutions. And I think, so like to me that feels like mapping those interactions and being aware of how do we learn from the past and build on the things that exist that are very powerful, but then also asking per Wolfgang, what's really new here and what is changed and what does it force us to reevaluate and to understand how those things may be changed.
I think it's important to think about the fact that we shape, the technology shapes the way that we work and the way that we govern and the way that we think, but we also shape the way that the technology is built. So in a sense, I think that something that we established here with a lot of the comments yesterday is that these kind of discussions are still very high level, they're very abstract. And we really need to put an emphasis, and this is kind of like what the conference is doing right now, which is really important, is to really make this into actionable points, really think about these kind of things. And for example, I was in the business model. We need to create a business model that is actually something that is actionable for companies, for governments, for startups to think about in that sense, because the shaping goes both ways. The technology shapes us, but we also shape it. So the fact that a lot of us are here and there is this sense of inclusion and collaboration means that we are going to go out and shape what the technology is going to look like. So in a sense, it's I think that the discourse in itself is kind of disempowering, because we talk about how the technology is going to change everything and what are we going to do and how are we going to stay in control of it. But we are in control of it. We are making it. This is a human product. So in a sense, we need to kind of start thinking about actionable points that we can take from this to make sure that all of the visions that we come out with out of this conference for inclusion will actually become a reality.
Thank you. I think as we think about big overarching issues, really important to ground them in things that we can act on in the case study conversation that'll happen later, but to think about how we go further and deeper and become more sort of through more micro explorations, more precise in our understandings, more nuanced. Other comments, especially over at the back?
Okay, just an overall suggestion, Alex Kakuru, that perhaps one of the ways we could adopt as an analytical framework is to look at AI in different components or clusters, such that we could have maybe, we construct it into what may be process components of AI, what could be system components of AI, what could be instrument/tool components of artificial intelligence, and then what could be outcome components. And then within each of the realm of these clusters, we can try and fit in so that we are able to start looking at issues in a sort of a compartmentalized way, knowing that they are all interconnected at some point, but it gives us a good analytical framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Melanie? Back.
Thanks. I would like to continue on the Coda's law comparison. It's completely true, and it's something we started to discuss in the governance session. And I just forgot what I wanted. No, I remember now what I wanted to say. We mentioned that if we compare earlier when we were meeting as a Creative Commons community in order to try to build an alternative to what by then seemed to be the most pervasive, dangerous thing for what was inclusivity by then was access to knowledge. What we tried in terms of resistance was to develop and build an alternative, and which took the form of a legal hack of copyleft. So what would be an alternative way to conceptualize and to develop this regulation through technology? What would be the copyleft of AI?
There's a fellow called Stephen Duncan who talks about the tyranny of the possible and the challenge of seeing what's in front of you and all of the barriers, and then only being able to imagine a gradient away from where we are now, versus kind of an imaginative approach to imagine that future that you want. The copyleft version, the thing that is the AI and inclusion atmosphere that we want, and then think about how do we build back from that? What does it take to get there? Thank you, Melanie. We have about 5 minutes left. Is that right on this, or can we, Chimai, she wants to sit. Okay, it's not. Chimai.
Thank you. So it's two separate interventions. I'm cheating a little. One is building off of what Nishant was saying, which is that there are two tracks to this. There's the urgent, and then there is the longer term. I'm thinking a little bit about how internet governance worked and how for advocacy it was useful to have a few powerful ideas like intermediary liability and safe harbor that were easy to pick up and build into systems around the world. So I think it would be useful to start doing that for AI. Something like the campaign against killer robots, for example, self-explanatory, powerful. But I think that as a task, this is something that I might prioritize. The second is that what's been useful to me as an academic in a setting like this is that I'm hearing a lot from disciplines that I have no conception of how to navigate. But equally, I'm recognizing a lot that, so for example, the whole code is law model, that's a Ryan Calo, Jack Balkin series of papers, which I think that people that are not lawyers and obsessed with liability might enjoy reading. So one of the outcomes that I'd love to see is sort of a basic list with a flagging of this is something that someone from another discipline can understand, because I feel like that would increase our shared knowledge much faster.
Like it.
Only to clarify, I think about bridging communities, there is no opposition between checking AI against human rights, humanitarian, and development goals. We need to do all of them. And we spoke here about jobs, about the impacting economic, political elements of social inclusion that you will not find all of them in human rights instruments. You need to complement it with a development agenda, otherwise you lose the north and south divides and inequalities. And at this moment, there is a group of diplomats discussing that in New York without all the knowledge and evidence that you have. So about bridging communities, maybe they should have more evidence and discuss more with you, but here also maybe we can use what we have, which is a grid framework as a reference that is very progressive and addresses the social justice elements that are missing in some human rights approaches. Thank you.
Thank you. Any, as we bring this in for a landing, any last final thoughts, quick comments?
Thank you. One thing which kind of flows from what Melanie said as well is how environmental movements and other kinds of justice movements are something that we can learn from, because there's a lot of long haul work to be done as well. And so movement building around the various kinds of intersections and overlaps of the discussions that we had today are also what we need to look to as a next step.
Thank you, that's very helpful. I mean, as we think about this and see this as a place of intersection of so many different interests around the world across so many different communities, it seems it demands diverse participation, right? And that's an opportunity, I think, to bring in those other conversations because AI will have implications for all those different spaces and sectors. And then to kind of add that to the recognition that these movements take decades to reach fruition. That's very helpful. Okay, so as we are about to transition to lunch, first a final word from Carlos, but I just wanted to thank all of the groups for reporting out so briefly and thoughtfully, and all of you for engaging in what was, for me at least, a really productive, interesting conversation. So thank you.